Okay, so I'm talking off the cuff. Hopefully this will flow nicely. But what I'm talking about today is the difference between parametric or procedural textures. They're synonyms for the same thing, and material-based textures. So basically textures based off bitmaps. And why I think if you're ever going to use your poser figures or your poser scenes outside poser, you should never ever use procedural textures. So what is a procedural texture? Well, let me just show you this. So here's a sphere, two spheres in fact. The bottom one has a procedural texture, the top one has a regular a PBR or physically based material. So first of all, let me show you the physically based one. So if I go up to the material room here, you'll see that I have this. This is plugged into a poser surface, but it could just as easily be a cycled surface or whatever. So what I have here, I have three image maps. I have the diffuse image map, which is basically a wood texture. Then I have the specular map, which basically defines the highlights. And then I have a bump map, which defines the kind of roughness of it. Now, if I compare that to this one, this is a parametric texture. In the diffuse color node, all I have, in fact, this is one of the poser defaults, and I don't know why it's so badly made. I'll quickly improve it in a second. But what I have here is a brick node. So this is a parametric node. So this doesn't load a texture. This creates a texture mathematically or parametrically. Here, there are parametrically it means using parameters. So here we've got the size of the brick, the height of the brick, the amount of mortar. You can see stuff like that. And typically people would use parametric materials for creating things like noise or waves or water or maybe ground textures or something like some kind of grass texture, something like that. And they can be useful because they can scale with an object. So if I take that object, I can scale this texture up as big or small as I like, and the quality will be really, really good. Whereas a texture based on bitmaps, if I load this bitmap here, it can't go any larger than the size of the bitmap without starting to lose quality. So if this was, supposing this was a 250 by 250 pixel bitmap, which would be tiny, if I then wanted that to be, say, some decking on a house, and I was going to do a hero shot where the camera was going to be really close, that 250 pixel texture would quickly look really, really rubbish. Okay, so let me give you an example here. This is a Substance Designer texture called Red Gravel, and it's ironically, it is a parametric texture, but the parameters are in Substance Designer. Then it's exported as a tileable bitmap. So that's how. That's one of the ways that you should be thinking in terms of making your textures. So that tileable bitmap then comprises. Let me just go to the folder. Comprises these elements. So we've got a base color or a diffuse color, they're both the same. We've got a glossy, which is basically specular. And then we've got a height map, which you could use for displacement or for bump map. And then we've got a normal map and roughness map also, depending on the color mode. There is a separate specular mode, but that doesn't work in Pose. It works in a different a different program's modeling space. So these are the image maps that I could then apply to any object in Poser here to create a texture. So if I look at these two now and just render them, you'll see that they both look good. But here's the massive problem. Parametric textures don't export to other programs. So DAZ Studio, for example, has a much better lighting engine. So supposing I wanted to export a poser scene and render it in DAZ Studio, which is a perfectly valid, Poser's got a really nice renderer, but it has a really bad lighting and it's really bugged. So supposing I wanted to create a poser scene and then save it as a poser scene and then import that into DAZ Studio. Okay, so here's a scene in DAZ. I've not actually imported this, I've just created this in DAZ. But there's an import mode here, and there's a poser studio, poser mode import there. You can import scenes. It's not very good. A lot of the stuff won't import. But here's a really important thing, that in DAZ it doesn't recognize any of the advanced material modes, and it definitely doesn't recognize parametric material. So to show you what I mean here, let me just choose main camera. So here's a Victoria 4 with an elite texture. I think that's Anastasia, is she called? Let's have a look. So here's an elite texture, and it's who is she? Natasha, sorry. And you'll see here that this uses the full poser material room. So we've got image maps, but we've also got advanced nodes, parametric nodes. We've got a skin node here, which doesn't even work in poser anymore since they went up to a Superfly rendering mode. You can tell that because it's got this dotted line that would have been translucence. Then it's got all of these weird parametric modes here as well. And then it's got image maps. So essentially, when you import this figure, or when you just load it into DAZ, what will happen is all of these other nodes will essentially be eliminated, and it will just try to recreate that in DAZ. And if I show you here, here's a Superfly render in sorry about that, I just bashed the pop filter against the microphone. Here's a Superfly render of this woman. And interestingly, the elite texture was designed for Firefly. So here's a Firefly version, and you'll notice down here her buttons and the trim on her jacket actually look better, because I think they're possibly displaced. Her skin kind of, this is how it was designed to be. Her fingernails down here, I actually think her eyes are better, her lips are better, her fingernails look better. Not too sure about her jacket. You'll see that displacement or bumping down the side is all gone. But now if we go to the same figure in DAZ Studio and give that a quick render, well, relatively quick because DAZ Studio is not that fast, you'll see actually, even though the materials here in DAZ Studio are missing some of the features that were in the poser version, particularly the ones that would have given the skin a bit more life, like the translucence, which possibly would be replaced in some of the Superfly things. So translucence gives the skin kind of a sheen, as if it's kind of wet looking. Maybe just a little bit of depth to it, but even missing those features, look at the lovely hair here, look at the lovely eyes here. So this is oh goodness me, what's the renderer called? iRay render in DAZ, and because the lighting and the iRay render are really good, you'll see that there's just a whole lot more pop to this image than if you see the poser image. The poser image, I think, is relatively lifeless by comparison, whichever one you choose. However, if I wanted to take this image to, say, this figure into, say, Blender, I'd have to export it using Collada, for example, which is probably the best way to get poser scenes into another program now, since they've got rid of Poser Fusion. And Collada doesn't recognise, nor does OBJ, object format. In fact, none of the exporters recognise procedural or parametric materials. So at least with Blender has a cycles engine. So if this was a cycles texture, I could recreate it in Blender. I couldn't export from here and then Blender would recognise it, but at least I could recreate it. So what would be the solution? Well, as I showed you here, This is a texture made with material, with actual bitmaps, and this texture is made procedurally. So suppose we wanted a procedural brick texture. I'll choose that one. What I would have to do is I'd have to go into a third-party program. So I've got 3 here. I've got Genetica Studio, which is a really old, an old program, which got superseded by Substance Designer. Substance Designer is now an industry standard, and here we have a wood texture. It's what's known as a node-based texture. So what happens is you string together nodes which give the texture its properties. And although this is also a parametric node-based system, very, very versatile. You can change the color, you can change the grain, anything you like, any parameter you like. The output from this program is a bitmap. So you could either create a bitmap directly UV mapped onto a figure. So UV mapping is when you take an object and you give it coordinates, and then the texture wraps around those coordinates. So going back here to Poser, for example, on Victoria's skin, there's a map here, but really what's a UV map which defines where different parts of the texture are applied to her. But if I look at a face, although her face is kind of face shapes here, if I go to the material, you see that the face actually comprises of a 2-dimensional map. There you go. So that's UV unwrapped, basically. So UV represents a coordinate space. It's basically a 3D version of X, Y, and Z that works in 3D space for models. So UV and W. So this UV map here, within Substance Designer, I can take a figure and I can build a parametric texture straight onto a UV mapped figure, and then I can give it various properties and then still export a 2D bitmap. And then what that means is that whenever I take that figure into other programs, I can then apply the bitmap and the different parts that comprise it. So as I said earlier, let me just go to this gravel example. I would have my base color, then I'd have my glossiness or specularity, roughness possibly, normals for displacement, height maps for bump, and or roughness for bump, it all depends. And that then is program independent. It doesn't matter which program I take this into, whether it's 3D Studio, Cinema, 3D, Blender, or any of the other programs. I can then use these same bitmaps and get the same essential result. I might need to tweak a little bit, but I wouldn't need to completely rebuild the texture from scratch. So I guess I've probably rambled a little bit at the end. One other program that I've just discovered. This is a free program called Material Maker. It's not as good yet as Substance Designer, but it does still use the idea of parametric substance creation. I think this has got an awful lot of promise, and because it's free, it's one to look up. Material Maker. Now, I say it's free, it's actually you donate whatever you think it's worth. But I suppose at the moment it tends to lend itself to stylized textures, although this plank texture is quite nice. But when it gets to a stage where it's competing with Substance Designer, then I think it will really be something worth looking at. So perhaps for now you might just download it for free, and then when you think it meets your needs, you could give them a donation. It's probably worth $50, $100. One thing it can't do, which Substance Designer can do, if I go to here again, this is a UV map texture that's probably created in Substance Designer. And the reason that I say that is because it has wear and tear. So what happened was they probably created a blue paint material for the top of this waste bin, then a grey paint material here, added an icon, an image there to represent that throwing away hand or whatever it is, that there. But then it has wear and tear here, and kind of dribbles here from the rain and the rubbish that's been put in it. And that is one of the massive things that happened in Substance Designer, which Poser stuff in the old days when you had to make your textures in Photoshop. Very, very few texture creators had the skill or the time, the effort to add this kind of wear and tear. But now it's just a couple of nodes in Substance Designer. So you go into Substance Designer, you build your substance, then you add a couple of wear and tear nodes here, and you can say do them on certain edges or certain heights or certain faces, and it will just automatically add wear and tear to your textures. So that's really excellent. So anyway, guys, I kind of rambled a little bit, but I hope that the main takeaway is that if you only use Poser, then using parametric or procedural textures is fine. But as a good practice, if you want to achieve this brick, for example, you would be better off to create a brick bitmap in another program and then import that bitmap into Poser, and then you know that object there can be exported to other programs, and it'll play nice in DAZ, it'll play nice in Blender, it'll play nice in any other program that you want to use. So if you're hoping to increase your repertoire of programs you work with, or you already work with third-party programs, just don't use parametric materials. Okay, hopefully you found that interesting, and I will speak to you later.